Well, as Jeremy said, we almost made it through our review last week of our first lesson book. And I was going to leave it, but I decided that might not be wise. We need to be reminded of where we left Israel in our study of 1st and 2nd Kings. If you remember, King David had transferred the ruling of Israel over to his son Solomon as he neared his death. Remember that in the beginning of 1st Kings. And Solomon began to rule in splendor and glory. He built and dedicated the temple, the dwelling place of God with Israel. He built his palace. It was built with the same expensive materials that were used in the temple. The stonework was elaborate, cedar pillars from Lebanon. It was this palace that the Queen of Sheba visited him, seeking out Solomon's wisdom and splendor. Israel at that time was world-renowned. It was a nation above all other nations at that time. And Solomon reigned, if you remember, in the beginning with righteous wisdom from God, directing a prosperous nation. But then his nation and his reign collapsed, didn't it? It collapsed in dishonor and division because of Solomon's love for foreign women and idolatry. The once glorious nation of Israel now splits in two. And in 2 Kings, we see the continued decline and destruction of the northern kingdom, Israel, and the southern kingdom, Judah. God's people, his chosen nation, are now a disgrace to themselves and to the nations around them. And God turns his back on them at this point and allows them now to be carried off into captivity. And Israel, the northern kingdom, goes into Assyrian captivity, and Judah, now with Jerusalem destroyed, is carried off into Babylonian captivity. There's something, devastating about sin that we need to consider at this moment. When we are punished for wrongdoing, there is a terrible sting to that. But there's nothing like the deep pain that we experience when we remember how things were before the consequences of our sin caught up. I want you to turn to Psalms 137 and follow along with me as I read this. And this is where we left God's people. Okay, God has banished them into captivity. And here's what we read of them now as we begin in 2 Chronicles. Psalms 137. And put ourselves as best we can into the shoes of those from Judah at this time. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. Upon the willows in the midst of it, we hung our harps. In other words, they cared not to play music. They hung their harps up. For there our captors demanded of us songs, and our tormentors mirth, saying, "Sing us one of those songs of Zion." How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forgot you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget her skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. If I do not remember you, if I do not exalt Jerusalem above my chief joy. Remember, O Lord, against the sons of Edom, the day of Jerusalem, who said, "Raz it to its very foundation." O daughter of Babylon, you devastated one, how blessed will be the one who repays you with the recompense with which you have paid us. How blessed will be the one who seizes and dashes your little ones against the rock. I just thought that psalm was pretty fitting. we travel from Genesis through 2 Kings, and we watch how so many times God blessed Israel. And yet she allowed sin into her life, and God punished her. And now here she sits, crying and remembering what God had once given to her. And I just thought, it's good for us to think of those things. We won't be sitting by the rivers of Babylon, but eternity's coming. And so as we leave there, let's see now what the future holds for Israel as we start into our second book. Start into 1 Chronicles. And 1 Chronicles now is the 13th book.
Hit the space bar on the keyboard.
Yeah, might be easier. Yeah, I'll use the hand one. That's not working. 1 Chronicles now is the 13th book of the Old Testament, and it's the 8th book in the section designated as the history section. 1 Chronicles. Now, it primarily contains the national history of Israel. From Genesis through 2 Kings, we've had a continuous historical record of Israel. The northern and southern kingdoms have received equal attention up until now. But now here in 1 Chronicle, the writer gives new history, no new history, but he travels back in recorded time all the way to Adam. And why is that? What purpose will that serve? Well, we shall see. Our first thought, that Dave's question he's asked us is, how does the history of Israel presented in 1 Chronicles differ from the manner in which the same history is presented in the books of 1 and 2 Samuel? If you remember 1 and 2 Samuel, it records the transition from the period of the judges to the time when the kingdom of Israel was established. Okay? Samuel, he was the last of the what? Was Samuel?
Judges.
Right. He was the last of the judges, and he was the first of the national prophets. And he anointed King Saul, okay, of Israel, and then he anointed David, his successor. Samuel presents in his book the sinful state into which Israel had fallen. The political history in Samuel is presented from a moral point of view, and also a prophetic point of view, as we see in the constant record of the consequences of sin within the nation. But as Dave has asked us, how does Chronicles differ? Jeremy?
Well, the first 10 chapters about, I think it's right, it may go into your second question, I don't know which order you're doing it in. Well, the book of 1st and 2nd Chronicles was written after the Israelites, or Judah and them, came back from captivity. First 10 chapters are outlining genealogical history, so Israel remembers their history. As far as, remember, these people had been in captivity for 70 years, and this was, they needed to reestablish the Levitical priesthood. Genealogies were necessary for that. But it goes back even to Christ, showing that through Adam, they were through Abraham, and then all the different tribes. It was to set up everything else, but the history is shorter. It's almost giving an overview. This is your history. Mm-hmm. This is what happened. This is who you are. It's giving almost the children of Israel their history back, so that the generations that are here know that they're the chosen people of God, and this is how they got here. At least that's from my view. That's an overview, but
exactly. Yeah, those are all good points, and we'll see come up to those points throughout the lesson. And really, where you were heading was 1 Chronicles emphasizes The emphasis is not on the historical side of things, but on the spiritual side of things. And it's written from a priestly point of view. The writer, it seems, as Jeremy mentioned, is meeting the special difficulties of the day. As Jeremy said, Israel now, Judah's 70 years in captivity. That's a long time. Some of us that are older would be dead by now. The younger generation that was born, they might be 60, 50, 60 years old. They lived amongst the Gentiles, for that matter. But the Bible Believers commentary pointed this out. I thought was interesting. Thus, Chronicles concentrates on the reign of David and his successors, and on the temple and on its worship. It gives details that are not previously found concerning the priests, the Levites, the musicians, the singers, the doorkeepers. It elaborates on the transporting of the ark to Jerusalem. It elaborates on the preparation for the building of the temple, and on reforms of some of the better kings of Judah. Remember, there was a few good kings. The northern kingdom is only mentioned in its dealings with David's dynasty. There's not much of it in this book. The chronicler even passes over the tragic stories, if we remember some of them horrible scenes of Amon, Absalom, and the faithlessness of Solomon. We don't read that in Chronicles. And so the book of Chronicles, the books of Chronicles are by no means an unnecessary repetition. Rather, they are a spiritual interpretation of the history of the preceding books.
It also, in not giving the more gruesome details, we might say, was showing Israel that righteousness could be done. There were like, as far as 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings gives a big over long drawn history of Israel through a period of 400 years. Chronicles is more focused, as you were saying, that the chronicler is not the children of Israel would have 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, but they needed to be shown that people could be righteous. God is not expecting too much, and by showing these examples, it's like when we go to Hebrews 11, the chapter of faith. That chapter follows the same line. Righteousness and faith can be done. We don't have all of the evil things that Abraham did. We have the righteous things that he did. And the same with all of the others as well, showing that they had faith. Mm-hmm. And so it's not that the chronicler minimizes sin. He doesn't. Mm-hmm. But his purpose is different.
Right. Well, and at this time, too, we might say that the writer of 1st Chronicles is interested in one thing. His people are now leaving captivity. They're going back to their homeland. They're going to be able to go back to worshiping Jehovah. They need to be encouraged, not reminded of their sins and beat them into the ground. They need to be encouraged now. God has remembered you in captivity. He is letting you go back. So we can see slight wisdom on the part of the writer is to encourage the people. But we look now, we'll try this switch again. No. We look now then at the origin of 1st Chronicles. And as in our last series, we begin with the title. And we're asked the question then, why is the book called 1st Chronicles? And how is this title different from the original Hebrew name of the book? The books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, remember, they were originally regarded as one book, same as 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Samuel. Now, if we had some Hebrew scholars in here, it'd be great, but I'm not one. So what I done was I put up the original name. Here's the original name of of Hebrews or not of Hebrews, of First, Second Chronicles. That's the Hebrew name, and it simply meant the account of the days, or the words of the days. That was the original meaning of the title. And then if you recall then, when the Septuagint version was made, okay, of the Old Testament, then the book was divided into 2 volumes. And it was referred to then at that time by the Greek description, and my Greek's as good as my Hebrew, so I put up the word for you. And the meaning, that's kind of what I wanted us to center on. The meaning in the Greek meant things omitted. And then, when Jerome came along, as he decided to make a Bible in the Italian language, the Latin version, he called it a chronicle of the entire divine history. And so this title has been carried over into our English versions. And it's an appropriate title, as it contains chronicles in an orderly fashion, the historical events of Israel's history, and also the record of King David's reign. And so we see that even though the titles have changed with the translators have held true to the content of the book. The book hasn't changed, and even with the different names, we see the idea all along in either name of the idea of the past, the things that he wants to remind Israel of. And remember, if you have any comments now, like Jeremy said, go for it. And next we want to look at the author. And we're asked, who traditionally considered the author of who is traditionally considered the author of First Chronicles? And what evidence within the book supports this possibility? Who do we?
Ezra. And actually, I don't know on First Chronicles, but if you have your Bibles with you and go to Second Chronicles, which would have been, as you said, one book, the ending of Second Chronicles and the beginning of the next book, Ezra, is almost the exact same.
Right.
The language is exactly the same. So First Chronicles would have, and Second Chronicles would have had to have been written later, or this addendum on the end of Second Chronicles would have been added later, because Cyrus didn't exist if it was before captivity. And
right.
that the language is almost exactly the same, and the writing styles are pretty similar.
But
it is safe to say that Ezra most likely is the writer. If he's not, he wrote portions of it.
Right.
Just like in First and Second Kings and First and Second Samuel, whether or not there was a few writers is unknown, but Ezra is a good guess.
Right. That's right. James, did you have your hand up?
No, I was.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yes, Jewish history too. In the Babylonian Talmud, it's a commentary. It credits the writings of the books to Ezra. Ezra, this is who Ezra was. Ezra 7 and verse 6 reads, "This Ezra went up from Babylon, and he was a scribe, skilled in the law of Moses, which the Lord God of Israel had given. And the king granted him all he requested, because the hand of the Lord his God was upon him." That's who Ezra was. Okay? There's some strong evidence that, as Jeremy said, that lend the opinion towards him. First is that he himself, Ezra, devoted himself to leading the remnant of Judah in spiritual and religious reform. We read that in Nehemiah 8 and in chapters 12 and 36. In Ezra, chapter 7 to 10. Chapter 7 is a chapter that you need to read. But the books could not have been written, though, before Ezra's time, as they contained the genealogy of Zerubbabel. And Zerubbabel led the first wave of Jews home. We read that in 1 Chronicles chapter 3, verses 17 to 24. And as well, as Jeremy had pointed out, as the mention of the decree of King Cyrus to allow the captives, first of all, to leave Babylon. We read that in 1 Chronicles chapter 36, 22 to 23. Maybe I'll read that. It's did I put down the wrong passage, I think? No, 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verses 22 to 23. And this is where we read of Cyrus. Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he sent a proclamation throughout his kingdom, and also put it in writing, saying, Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among you of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him, and let him go up. Isn't it wonderful how the Lord works? You know, we see him using whomever he will to fulfill his purpose. And here now we read that right in the beginning of verse 22. In order to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah. Jeremiah prophesied it, and here we see God is taking his people out of captivity. And also, the book focuses on the temple and the priesthood, and is written, as I said earlier, from a priestly point of view. And also, there's some words and terms that are used in Chronicles and the book of Ezra that are similar, and they were not used. Secular Jewish history says that they weren't used before this time. And again, my excellent Hebrew, I wrote things out. Ezra uses phrases and words of the Hebrew for golden cups, a drachma, rafts or floats, and that was used in 1 Kings, but it differs. If you can see, the two Hebrew words differ greatly from the ones in 1 Kings. And so it's just another thought that, things were different. This was after the captivity. Oh, okay. But still, remember we said in our first book with the authors and with the date, still after much study and things that are similar, the fact remains Ezra's not mentioned in the book as it's authored. But it's just interesting to see these points. And the next thing that we'll look at, is the date. Is the date in 1 Chronicles. As in our last series, can you remember what we always used, what verse we always used as our basis? Every Sunday morning this verse came up, 1 Kings chapter 6 and 1. We use this as the basis of our timeline. And it's interesting that in 2 Chronicles chapter 3 and verse 2 gives the same date, also to the day. And we notice, if you notice, I didn't notice this in the beginning, except for look through a little bit of study, but we notice now the names used for Israel's months are names, Ziv. And if you remember, before they were simply called the first month or the second month and so on. These names are Chaldean. And it's said that they've been used after the captivity. Before the captivity was first month, second month. Now we just kind of see maybe the influence that people living in a different land, how they're influenced. But
Bill, before you go, so we do the same thing.
Yeah.
January, February, March, April, they're all Roman.
right,
As far as those have a Roman order, we do the same thing.
yeah,
It wasn't wrong that they picked up months,
Oh, no,
names
no.
for their months. It just shows, as you were saying, even in the language, changes in language, dialects change. Like as far as if you live in a country for 70 years,
but,
it's going to change.
Exactly.
Even your own language. Like as far as languages, English changes every 100 years. There's new words, changes in the meanings of words. What way, if we were to be able to come back 100 years from now, what would English look like? Might be a lot shorter, seeing we text with a lot shorter forms. Who knows? But it's
Right.
but
I
culture.
don't think there'd be such a thing as a sentence in a hundred
Maybe
years,
you never
will it?
know. Culture changes and words change with them.
Right, that's right. Like Tammy was saying the other day, kids don't know how to write anymore, cursive. Everybody prints. Things do change. But that's a good point, and that kind of backs up the thought of the writer of Chronicles. Again, they've been in captivity for 70 years. So all the religious reform, where is it gone? It's forgotten. Because they've lived with the Gentiles.
And they wouldn't have had a temple.
Right,
They
no
wouldn't have-
temple.
Would have no temple. Would have had
No
no
priests.
feasts. Well, they might have had some
Well,
observances of the feasts, but not the
it-
same way.
Right.
Like as far as I'm not
Right.
saying they had no, like they
Yeah.
probably observed the Passover, but they wouldn't have had the same priestly things that go with it, and it may have been a more subdued or smaller observance because the Babylonians don't observe Passover.
Right.
The Babylonians don't observe all of the other Jewish feasts. And so it was a retelling, all right, this is what we do. This is how we do it. And now this is the way, like these reforms are going to set forth through the time of Jesus.
Right.
Ezra started it. Well, as far as Ezra recordedly started it, as far as it probably was started before, but Ezra recorded it. And these same types of things carry on all the way through the 400, I'm going to give away your question, I guess, 450 years till Christ.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly true. And we could understand that in our cases. If we were taken to a foreign land for 70 years, where there was no church, no nothing, what would we be needed to be reminded of in the same situation? But as always, then we begin our timeline then in 966 BC is recorded in 1 Kings. And now we move up to the time of 586. And Judah was conquered by Babylon in that time. That was the time that the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple by King Nebuchadnezzar. And also at this time, he took the rest of the people to Babylon as slaves when he finally leveled the city.
And just so people know, we've been talking about 70 years all the way through, and you come along and say 586 to 539,
Right.
maybe 50 years. The conquest of Jerusalem took 20 years.
Right.
It started, like as far as we read the end of 2 Kings, and we think, oh wow, it happened so quickly. Babylon in history sieged Jerusalem for 3 years.
Right.
And took captives in waves. Daniel and Ezekiel and those prophets being among the first, and then Jehoiachin and the kings being among the last. So
Right.
the entire period, Dave doesn't have 606, but the entire period's 20 years, and that's where 70 years comes from.
Right. I wrote all that out, and I was going to bring it, and then I thought it might have been too much more to add into this. But there was 3 waves when Israel was taken into captivity, and then served the 70 years. That's good to point out. And so then, we're at Judah being conquered by Babylon, and then in 539, Babylonian captivity ends. Babylon was conquered by the Medes and Persians, and which was led by King Darius and King Cyrus. And soon after this time, Cyrus gives the Jews permission to return to their homeland. And since the content then of 1 Chronicles continues to this time, it must have been written after the exile. But the problem with this date is that the return of the Jews is written in the Septuagint, remember? But it wasn't made till 205 and 150 BC. So Chronicles must have been completed prior to 250 BC. With the tradition of Ezra being the book's author, then the date of completion, we think most likely would be around 450 BC. But as we said all through our first series, dates, and I read something interesting because I come across a lot of different years, and there's people that change these years to fit into the theory of the rapture and the second coming of Christ. So they manipulate these years to fit their different religious theories. So we can't base our faith on these dates, as we said in the first study. But it's interesting. It gives us an idea of the years, roughly how things happened and were laid out before the time of Christ and his death upon Calvary. And so then we leave it at around 450 BC that First Chronicles was written. And so now then let's take a moment and consider the purpose of First Chronicles. We had some thoughts earlier which are going to fit in, and as we look at the purpose, let's look at the historical purpose first and the significance of that. And we're asked the question, why would the historical information contained in First Chronicles be valuable to the Jewish remnant who returned from Babylon? And we need to first consider what information is in the book. Of course, First Chronicles seems to repeat First and Second Samuel, but with a closer look, we see some marked differences, some big differences. As we said earlier, First and Second Samuel, First, Second Kings, they emphasize the historical side of the nation, whereas First Chronicles reviews the same history, but the emphasis is on the spiritual nature of Israel. And we see that the Holy Spirit uses select history to aid in this spiritual review. For example, it presents the historical record from a priestly viewpoint. What are some, did you come across any thoughts of where the emphasis was placed upon, where the writer placed the emphasis in First Chronicles? Did you notice any, Jeff?
As we talked about earlier, if the emphasis in First Chronicles is on spiritual things, worship and the temple, God has always required that man worship in spirit and in truth. So then he would be providing them the guidance they need in order to worship in truth. If they have forgotten something, if they have lost something, they would be reminded.
Exactly. Yeah. Because as we said earlier, they've been 70 years away from their if we can use the term, their religious lifestyle. They've been away from that, so they need to. As Jeff mentioned, there's emphasis on the Levites, who they were, their job in God's name. Jeremy?
And again, the first 10 chapters of genealogies. Genealogies, we don't realize are so important to the Jews especially, and that's what they're missing today. And that's why they don't, well, among other things, it's why they can't reestablish the temple today.
Right.
God destroyed those, but they needed those then to establish the temple and the Levites. It wasn't just any Levite that could be a priest. It had to be of a certain family of Aaron.
Mm-hmm.
And we think genealogies, like as far as when we go back in our family history, we can go back so far, but eventually we run out of people to go back to. Well, Israel's been captive for 70 years. They need to know what tribe they're from, because that's important. And they need to know who the Levite priests are, who are the rightful priests, and they needed the genealogies for that. So that's why the first 10 chapters have all of those genealogies. And why did he write all the names? For that purpose.
Mm-hmm. Right. We need to remember that. That comes up a lot more in this lesson. Colin?
Yeah, I was wondering why now in Timothy the Lord says do not be concerned about genealogies and all these things. So that was a big thing, and it was necessary to trace back where they came from and so on, and what not to do, what to do. But now that we shouldn't be caught up in genealogies and new moon and full moon and this and that. So I was just wondering.
Right.
Genealogies would be of like the children of Israel. They're not as important. It's not wrong to look up who our family is.
No.
But as a religious standpoint, these genealogies were religious in nature as well. They were important.
Right.
And of the tribe of Judah, we need those because we need to know where Christ came from.
Right.
When we talk about Salathiel and Zerubbabel, and they're in there too, and those are important. There are two tribes that are of the utmost importance. One is Judah, and the other is Levi. The others are important too, but those are the two main tribes that are important to know what the families are, who the families were. And it's not, we don't read in 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. We read of the kings, we don't read of the Levites. They don't have that written down in those books. It needs to be recorded.
Right. That's right. And as the writer, 1st, 2nd Samuel, Kings had the historical side. Now we're beginning to see the writer aiming at the priestly side of Israel. And remember some of them points, because I'll bring them up next week. I didn't think we'd get to our...
We're pretty close on time, though.
To which?
We're really close on time.
Oh, doesn't your bell work?
It's not working today.
Oh, is it?
No.
Oh, okay, so we quit a quarter to, or no?
Just a little bit before quarter to.
Okay, well then, let's just finish off this question. As Jeff had pointed out, there's emphasis on the Levites, King David's preparations for the building of the temple, and his organization of worship in Israel. Remember that, how important that's going to be, we'll see. It also reinforces the importance of the reign and the dynasty of King David. And it's reviewed from chapters 11 to 29. That is reviewed. And the covenant that God made with David in chapter 17. We'll look at these later. And as we said, it also contains 9 chapters of genealogy, or genealogical lists. And so our question, why is this important? Well, it's all necessary because, as we have said, Israel's now lived 70 years surrounded by Gentile idol worship. Okay, no temple, no priests, a pitiful situation indeed for Judah. And now is the time. Okay, now is the time, beginning their return from the captivity, to be reminded of their spiritual heritage. They're going back to their homeland. and the seemingly endless genealogies would be of most importance, like Jeremy said, because now they have to restructure. Okay, they have to restructure the priesthood, which is the life of that nation. And we see that all the way through chapters 1 to 10. It's okay, then we'll leave it at that, and we'll pick up next week. Then we'll begin at the doctrinal purpose in 1 Chronicles.
How are you?